We have officially reached the day 2 of the semifinals, and we are experiencing a sort of deja vu, because once again, the match has been turned around for Magnus Carlsen. Lagrave managed to win the second match, and we are now in tiebreaks. Magnus did win, though, however, the very first tiebreak game, which means that Lagrave is forced to win on demand in order to take this match to an Armageddon. And let's see how the Frenchman tries to do exactly that. Will it end in defeat? Well, we will see. Alright, so 1e4, c5 from the Sicilian, from the world champion. He plays the sharp Sicilian, which is certainly a huge surprise, considering that the opening tends to get quite sharp. But he is quite comfortable in that territory apparently, and he knows his stuff, so he's not scared. Lagrave goes for knight f3. Magnus goes for knight c6, and Lagrave goes for bishop b5. Rosalimo is known for being kind of a solid approach to the Sicilian, but lately, or at least the last years, it has become quite popular, and it's known for actually posing a decent amount of problems to black. So that's why Lagrave goes for it. He figures out that he can't really compete with Magnus in the main lines, which would probably be Sveshnikov, because that's Magnus's headline and the Sicilian. So he decides that to go for bishop e5, which is an approach that does make a lot of sense. There are several moves here, d6 perhaps being the main move along with g6, and also e6. Magnus chooses the latter, e6. So they did play this earlier. Castles, knight e7, this is the main line, and here I believe Lagrave plays something different with rook e1. I think he played b3 earlier, but in all honesty, I do not quite remember. Well, I think he did. I could certainly be wrong though, but he plays rook e1, and Magnus goes for knight d4, knight takes d4, c takes d4, and we have c3 here on the table. e6 from Magnus. He wants to be able to play knight c6, but he cannot really do that as long as the bishop is on b5. And here we see yet another reason why Lagrave plays rook e1, and that's bishop f1. And knight c6 is finally played, and now we can develop our bishop. We want to put it on c5, and of course Lagrave knows this, so he plays b4 in order to prevent that. So now the bishop has to go to b7, e7 instead. a4 from Lagrave, castles, and then knight a3. He takes c3, he takes c3, bishop f6, attacking the pawn on c3. Also attacking the pawn on b4 due to the rook hanging on a1. But Lagrave, he doesn't care. He plays b5, and this is certainly an interesting option, because he's simply sacrificing the pawn on c3, and he played this extremely quickly. Has Lagrave taken a look at this at a greater depth? Maybe. And that's indeed what Magnus thought. So he did not dare to take this pawn. I personally think I'm not sure what his plan was, but I think it was to take on c6 and after bishop a1, perhaps bishop f4 with some c7 ideas. But it does not quite look like it works, so I'm quite curious about what Lagrave's idea was here. Maybe just simply play rook b1 and say that I have a lot of play for the sacrificed pawns, and also the exchange, because the rook here is also hanging. Does seem a little bit dubious, but I think Lagrave had an idea there, and I'm very curious to see what that was. However, Magnus took on b5, and after knight takes b5, if white suddenly has a lot of initiative, d5, Magnus takes the center, bishop a3, bishop e7, e takes d5, e takes d5, bishop takes e7, and knight takes c7. And after queen d4, white is very active. White has a lot of active pieces. Notice this rook on e1, this rook on a1 also, this queen on d4, this knight on b5, and black does not really have a lot of activity. So this is kind of a rough situation for Magnus to be in, because Lagrave has at this point of the game played extremely quickly. And not only that, he has a great position too. So he's leading on the position, he's leading on the clock. Magnus is going to struggle in order to draw this game. Queen f4, bishop e6, protecting the pawn. Rook ab1, and here comes a great move by Magnus, and that is d4, which is, I think, probably by far the best move in the position. A really good move, and the point of this move is that it blocks this queen's protection of this pawn on on d4. So after, if I take this pawn, I will simply take here, and then I'll take on d4 next, and it will very likely end in a draw. So Lagrave, he is forced to go for the complications with with knight c7, rook takes a4, knight takes c7, f takes c6, and queen g4, attacking the pawn on e6. Queen f6 is a great defending move, defending the pawn, and also attacking on f2, and Lagrave needs to play f3 in order to protect that pawn. Notice now that this rook is now pinned, because if I take here, then the rook is falling, and that is a crucial point in the position. So Magnus has to do something about that, so he plays queen f5, which I think is also a great move. He wants to trade off the queens, and Lagrave didn't really have any choice, because if he decides to ignore that with queen h4, there are several good options. Probably being sadistic with queen f6 is one way to do it, but also queen c5 looks quite strong when I'll take on c3 next, and Magnus would not lose that. So queen takes f5 is the logical way, and after e takes f5, rook takes b7, we are in an endgame, which is not as easy as it looks. Things are quite complicated here. Magnus takes on c3, bishop b5, and here the only move to save material is knight d8, rook c7, and rook b4. Magnus is defending well, but it is a tricky and complicated position. It's not easy to be Magnus Carlsen here, considering that Lagrave is leading on time, and also has a dangerous initiative. King d8 is a logical move. There is no rook takes g7 at the moment, because then I'll simply play something like knight e6 or even knight f7, and the position would end. The game would end in a draw. So Lagrave plays bishop d3, and rook d4 is the first inaccuracy by Magnus, and it's definitely a very logical move. But the problem with that is that he simply loses his pawn on f5, and you really have to defend this pawn. One way to do that would maybe simply be to play h6, and the point is that if I now take on g7, I can play knight e6, and after rook h7, king g8, it is not really too dangerous, because I get activity. This pawn is very dangerous, and white doesn't have enough. There is no breakthrough here. For example, rook takes h6. We have a knight takes c7, so that is not possible. And we can't take the pawn, that pawn either, because that would leave the pawn on h7 hanging. So if I, for example, play rook a7, then a move like rook d4, for example, would be great, and then we will undermine the fact that rook is hanging and try to trade rooks later with rook a8. So this is very complicated. Of course, it's extremely difficult with little time, but surely, and with more time, Magnus probably would have found it and realized that he absolutely has to protect this pawn. Because the problem is that although he gets some play here with rook d2 and rook d4, it's just not good enough. Because it's easy to play white here. I'm only going to take this pawn, and then I'll go back and attack here. Then I'll simply push my pawns, and this knight is out of the game. And at some point, Magnus is going to be in great zugzwang. Let's see what happens. He needs to defend on g7, and the only way to do that is rook g8, h5, h6. You kind of have to stop h6 there. Rook takes c3. Rook d6 makes sense to avoid any threat later on with putting the rook on the 6th rank and then taking this pawn followed by rook h7 mate. It's kind of a typical theme. So rook d6 makes sense. The problem with that is that after rook c8, it is unfortunately for Magnus a forced lost pawn endgame, and he's kind of stuck here. And the only place to move the knight is on e6, but that loses, as we will see in the game. And if he does something else, let's see, say he, for example, plays rook d4, he would at some point just be completely out of moves. For example, what Lagrave could do is that he could move his bishop to this square and then later play rook c7 and win the pawn on g7. It is a very simple plan, for example, rook c2. So Magnus is kind of stuck here. He doesn't have any moves, and after knight e6, takes, and bishop d5, It is a brilliant trick by Lagrave, and he now has a winning pawn in game, which he did indeed win with great technique. And it is actually not as easy as it looks. White needs to be a little bit careful, but as long as he doesn't play f4 at the wrong time, I mean, it takes quite a lot for this to not be winning. But for example, g5 here would have been a draw after king e7, king f7, and king f5. A move like g6 here, this is kind of the typical trick. We now have this famous drawn position. That is the only trick black really has. But of course, Lagrave is not going to fall for that. He did take his time though, which is of course understandable considering the fact that it's so easy to make a mistake, but he was not going to fall for it. And after king f7, he has only one winning move, and that is f6, which does win the game. And here Magnus resigned, and the reason for his resignation is that if he takes the pawn, king f5 wins, and he will win one of the pawns. So if it goes to if Magnus goes to g7, we'll go to e6, and if it goes to e7, we'll go to g6. And yeah, that is pretty much it. A great fight between these two brilliant players, of course, and really well done by Lagrave. You gotta hand it to him. He played an excellent game here. Magnus probably could have held on with a more active defense, but with little time, and it's extremely difficult. And it's not surprising that Lagrave, with his initiative and really active play, was able to prevail in the end. I will mention that Magnus ended up winning the Armageddon just like against Dubov, and tomorrow we'll have a final between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley So stay tuned for that, and as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.